It's the Final Word Cricket Podcast Book Club. I think it's about edition 7 of Book Club. You've got Adam Collins with you today, and down the line with me co-hosting is, he's a man who's been on the show as a guest a couple of times. He's been on Book Club with his book a couple of months ago. It's the ABC's investigative journalist and former foreign correspondent to Europe, Steve Cannane. G'day, Steve.
Hi, Collo. Great to be on again.
I thought you'd be the perfect person to steer this conversation with me because the book we're going to talk about, Richie Benaud's Blue Suede Shoes, involves a whole bunch of cricketers that you interviewed before they died, because this series in 1961 means that we don't have many left, sadly, from that tour. But the book you wrote in 2009, many of them were, so you've got a great perspective on the way they saw the world.
Yeah, of the 11 who played that Old Trafford Test match, that thriller in 1961, I interviewed 5 of the Australian team: Bill Lawry, Bob Simpson, Neil Harvey, Richie Benaud, and Alan Davidson. And some of them, of course, reference this match. And it features a lot in Davo's book and also Richie Benaud's book. And in fact, he wrote a book called A Tale of Two Tests, where he references this one and the Tide Test. So it was very much a test in the forefront in their minds and their memories as a great test match, and something that really reflected the characters of those individuals.
And as it turned out, when we discussed First Tests, your book, a couple of months ago with Daniel Norcross, your back and forth with Richie Benaud was fascinating. And given the book's named after Richie and his blue suede shoes, which we'll come to in a moment with Harry Ricketts, who's kindly on the line with us as well, you've got a great sense of the way that Richie Benaud was put together, the way that he became the man that he became.
Absolutely, because I studied his where he grew up. He grew up in Jugeong, playing with a cricket bat made of packing case timber that his father crafted for him, learning how to play the forward defence in this storeroom, in a Department of Education storeroom in Jugeong. Then his dad, who was really a very good cricketer, but was denied opportunities because he had to go in the Depression and teach in the country. He ended up playing with his father in first grade cricket for Cumberland. His father was a very good bowler. But his father would drill into him at the dinner table, Richie told me this, really at breakfast and lunch and dinner, about attacking cricket, that you're out there to win the game from ball one. And Richie played that way all his life. And if you think of who he was as a cricketer, he was a leg spinner, so the most attacking form of bowling, in a sense, either that or fast bowling. He was a very attacking batsman. He scored one of the fastest test centuries ever against, I think it was South Africa. And also as a captain, he was an attacking captain. And this is, one of the central theses of this book is the risks that Richie took to win games, and how that really paid off at Old Trafford in 61 and led to Australia winning the Ashes with a team that, remember, Jim Laker at the beginning of that tour, the great English off spinner, probably the greatest spinner to play for England, said that he thought it was the worst bowling attack from Australia ever to hit the English shores, and they still won the Ashes.
Yeah, it doesn't date well, that quote, does it? So I mentioned we've got Harry Ricketts down the line, who it's a great thrill to have you with us. I've really enjoyed reading this book. And we often joke, Jeff and I, in our live shows that he's a poet and I'm a former political advisor. Well, you're a poet, for real. Jeff doesn't do it quite so much these days, a critic, and have been around the game for a long time. And we're a little boy when this series was being played in 1961, which will be the focus of our conversation today. I thought maybe where we should actually start, though, is the name of the book and the conceit of the book, really. I mean, I guess the premise is obvious, given it's such a great series, but yourself writing it with David Kynaston, what was the genesis of you two talking and saying that this is going to be a thing that we're going to do? And from there, how did you happen upon this rather grabby title?
Okay, so David and I have been friends for many years, 50 years. We went to school together. We weren't friends at school, but we became friends soon afterwards. And we were both obsessed with cricket. And I've lived in New Zealand for the last 40 years, but we have managed to play. Before that, we'd managed to play a bit together. He came to visit and we played half a season together here. So cricket, and we watch cricket whenever we can when we're together, and we talk cricket when we Zoom. So the book came out of wanting to do a cricket book together. David's a social historian. I'm a poet and was an academic until I retired. But we're both mad about cricket. David's written a few cricket books before. I've written one before, How to Catch a Cricket Match. And we wanted to, the idea was that part of our friendship would be kind of, knotted by doing this book together. Partly, how would we sort it out? So we had over the years, we've had various kind of projects that we might do. And then we hit on this one because it was a turning point in both our childhoods. For me, 1961 was the year that I became completely obsessed with cricket. I'd been pretty obsessed before, but I became really obsessed. And during that summer, I got turned into being what for the time was a fast bowler. I tried to bowl off breaks like Jim Laker, but somebody at the school I was at said, "You're tall, why don't you try and bowl fast?" And suddenly it completely changed my sense of myself as a cricketer. David also was kind of mad about it. We both remember this match in flashes and images. I watched the whole of the last day with my father, in the afternoon at least with my father. And so England were winning. Oh, they lost. And my childhood ended that day. So
I think that's quite relatable for a lot of people at being about that age. I know for me, the summer of 94, 95, when I would have been 10, so 1 year younger than you are in 61. I can remember that encyclopedically, that the details. It's when you first start forming memories, I think, that last a lifetime about sport around that age. So it makes sense that something as significant as the 1961 Ashes, such a brilliant series in so many ways, which you've gone into so much depth in this book, does stand out. Before we get into the Q&A here, I think the book title is so important to this because as people see it, when I've been telling people that I've been reading this book and it's come up on the podcast a couple of times and people are like, what, Richie Benaud's what on earth's going on here? It is immediately interesting. So tell us about his blue suede shoes, how you found out about it, and how you decided to call it that.
Okay, so it came about because when we were starting to do research for the book, David was reading a piece by John Woodcock in the Times, which talked about on the evening of the fourth day, at which point England are winning hands down, Benaud went out to inspect the wicket wearing blue suede shoes. And the minute he said this, we both kind of thought, blue suede shoes. And we thought Elvis Presley, of course. Carl Perkins writes the song. It's a huge hit for Elvis Presley. We thought, that's so Benaud. That's so Benaud that he's gone out there in his blue suede shoes. And that's the moment, clearly, that he concocted the plan to try and bowl to right-handers and left-handers, bowling his leg breaks into the rough outside the left-hander's off stump or the right-hander's leg stump. And so it all kind of clicked together. He's in these blue suede shoes. Peter May wouldn't wear suede shoes at all, let alone blue suede shoes. It's such a classy thing for him to have done. And it all seemed to click with this moment of revelation that he had. And he tries it out back in the dressing room with Ray Lindwall. And Lindwall, says to him, well, you have to be very good, otherwise it's going to be a disaster. And he backs himself. So it's about Benaud's style, his panache, and his doing things unorthodoxly. That's what we loved. And that's somehow the blue suede shoes seem to sum that up.
And Harry, another part of that story I love is that Richie not only had his father as his teacher for cricket, but also those senior players in the New South Wales dressing room. So Ray Lindwall was one of them.
Yep.
And also another one was Arthur Morris, who apparently gave Richie his taste for suede shoes that I was never aware of until I started reading the book. In fact, here's a little tidbit about Arthur Morris. I did one of the last interviews with him before he died, and I went up to his house. I didn't see any suede shoes in the house, but Arthur Morris was watching Al Jazeera at the time because he wanted to know what was going on in the Middle East. Now, how many contemporary cricketers would be doing that.
Whoa.
Arthur was a really, really interesting man. But back to that point, Richie learnt his cricket off Arthur Morris, Ray Lindwall, Keith Miller. These were the senior players in his dressing room at New South Wales. And just like in the Test team, Richie didn't perform that well when he started with New South Wales. He didn't perform that well with Australia, but those selectors saw something in Richie and they stuck with him, and it really paid off for Australia down the track, didn't it, Harry?
Yeah, that's exactly right, isn't it? I mean, he would, in 56, for instance, he does that amazing 97 at Lord's, which turns the game, helps to turn the game, and catches one of the all-time brilliant catches of Cowdrey in the gully. I mean, so fast, everybody's looking at the boundary, but he's caught it. So he could, he did have these sort of mesmerizing moments, but he didn't have the consistency. But they'd never have kept him in an England side if he'd been performing at that level. So it does say something about presumably Bradman, key player, I would guess at that point, that they just really backed them. And actually I would say over the years, that's been a tenet of Aussie selections. They haven't always come off, but a number of the very outstanding ones didn't necessarily fire straight away, but they were kept in a solid team and became world beaters, and that's what happened.
And when you say that, Harry, I think automatically of Bobby Simpson, who was in that Australian team in '61. Took him a very long time to get a century. And then Steve Waugh, similarly, it took a long while for him to get going, but both of them were shown faith, and it paid off later. And Benou was another part of that as well.
It didn't happen so much with didn't happen so much with the English selectors. Occasionally an amateur would be allowed to hang around for perhaps a little bit longer than they should have done. But the story of English cricket is littered with people who didn't play. People who were obviously really good players, but for some reason or another never got a go. One of the fascinations about this particular test in Old Trafford test, for me, is Mackenzie, and I got to talk to him. One of the complete thrills of my life was phoning him up and him telling me things I didn't know about the test. He told me a couple of things I hadn't come across anywhere else. It was completely thrilling, I can't tell you. So Mackenzie is 19. It's his third test. He comes in where the game is almost over. It's disaster, and he's been with a physio, so he's scrambling to get out there, get his pads on, get a box on, get out to the middle. There's crisis happening. 98-run partnership shifts the game. I mean, it's a wonder. It's a fantastic story. Let alone the 5 wickets he took on his debut at Lord's earlier in the summer. But here's somebody who's kind of thrown in to, he barely played for Western Australia, had he? You will know his record better than I do. And he's thrown into this environment, but he can swim. He can do it. He can't do it every time, but he can do it. And the English one who's thrown into this game is Jack Flavel. And because I lived near Worcester at the time, Flavel was a favourite of mine. And, he was 32. It looked as though cricket and tests had passed him by, but he was the bowler of the season. And so they needed another seamer, so he got to go. And he didn't do badly. In fact, he did pretty well, really. He was a kind of Hardman fast bowler. He roughed people up, and he really roughed up Norman O'Neill in this test match. So it's kind of fascinating. Cricket's such an interesting reader of character, isn't it? And reader of people taking opportunity or not taking opportunity, taking risks, being able to bring the skill level they've had before up up to this new environment and maybe even surpass it. Um, uh, that's part of the fascination of the game, isn't it? We were talking about Close earlier. Close has a 27-year Test career, and he's never really a certainty. He's always on trial, and he's usually convicted. And yet, he has his last Test at 45. What sport? There must be some, but there are not many sports where you'd be pulled out of the back room at 45 and shoved up as he was against the fastest attack in the world. I mean, it just, most other sports, the body just kind of retires you, sometime in your 30s, you don't really get to 40, or you get into a veteran class. But still, somebody like Close was playing Test cricket at 45. And of course, he was in this Test match and heavily blamed for what went wrong.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to getting into all of this with these characters you're mentioning there, like Mad Jack Flavel and Garth McKenzie. And I remember growing up, and Steve, you'd be the same. Whenever Richie Benaud was reflecting on the greats of Australian cricket, he'd never miss out on Garth McKenzie. He always had such a high regard for him as a player who almost got lost in that unusual decade of the 1960s, which cops a pretty bad rap. At the start of it's not bad. I'll tell you what, Calypso Summer followed by 61. So let's go back to what it felt like to be a cricket player and a watcher of the game in 1961. Let's set this up. So the Australian team come out by boat on the HMAS Himalaya, which again, I think is a nice touch because we think by then that they probably would have been flying out, but this was towards the end of the time when they came out by boat. The first tour game, which you were at Worcester, was on the 19th of April, 1961. They stayed for 28 weeks. I mean, talk about a tour, more than half a year in the UK. This was, I suppose, the peak of tours being a full season for teams like Australia when they would visit the United Kingdom. And by that, I mean not just England, but Scotland and parts of Ireland and all the rest of it, or Northern Ireland, I should say. But yes, like this first tour game, bookmarking it through, this is like just before my parents were born in that summer. And going back through it, that, you were 11, and what a time to make an impression, and how different the world was as well as a little boy there. I mean, this is before the Beatles. This is a few months after President Kennedy's been elected. This is before the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, this is a time in human history which is still so very much bookmarked by the Second World War, which had only finished 16 years before it. So, I mean, give us a sense of what it was like being a little boy and an avid cricket watcher in that environment.
Okay, so this was a very big deal for me. This was the first grown-up cricket match I'd ever been to. So it was a big deal. I was about to go, I went to boarding school in Kent, so that was a long way away. And so this was the first day of the game. I wasn't going to be able to see any more of it. My father took me, so that was a big deal to spend the day with my father. He was very keen on cricket. He was a quiet English army officer, not blimpish at all, quite introverted, in fact. And we often communicated best through cricket. So he would play with me in the garden. Hard luck, try again, well bowled, minimum of conversation, but, a game to play. So he took me, and I remember that Flavel got the two openers out. And my father said to me, that's the fast bowler's job, to get the openers. So he really approved of that. And I thought, that's the fast bowler's job, to get the openers. It was kind of picking up wisdom at the time. And it was a kind of chilly kind of day. Australia scored 177, I think. The Worcestershire off-spinner, Martin Horton, took 5 wickets. So Flavel didn't clean up, but he got the openers out. And then Graveney was coming in. Now, Tom Graveney at the time, he was a favourite player of my father's, who was born in Gloucestershire, and Graveney had been a Gloucestershire player. He had until quite recently been a Test player. He was captain of Gloucester, but then they demoted him and put an amateur in his place, an amateur who couldn't hold a candle to him as a player. And it kind of classic of the time that, a lot of counties like to have an amateur, even if they weren't worth their place. they still wanted to have the amateur. It was a kind of cachet of the time. So this is Harold Macmillan's England still, never had it so good. All those kind of cliches of the time. Very, a lot of royalty admiration still, a lot of attitudes that hadn't really kind of shifted, but were about to shift. This is the summer that Beyond the Fringe, the great kind of subversive comedy kind of thing with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and Alan Bennett, things were starting to kind of, the plaster was starting to crack a bit. But yeah, so there we are. And Graveney comes in the dark. It's getting pretty dark by then. And he bats 3 or 4. Worcestershire have lost some wickets. And he looks, so my father's really built him up. And it looks, he keeps missing. And so I say to my father in some kind of, why is he missing the ball? And my father said, he's deliberately missing it to get the pace of the pitch. And I don't know whether this was to cheer me up, because I was pretty distraught by this point, or whether he really thought that. I mean, maybe Graveney was so good that he could actually do that, miss on purpose. I've never been able to suss that out. But I got hooked on Graveney that day, and he was always the first score I would look for in the newspaper. The thing about this match for him was that Gloucestershire had been very unkeen on him moving when they got rid of him as captain. He was so annoyed that he said, I'm going. And so he moved to Worcestershire. And they made him have a year's qualification, they call it, but it was really disqualification. And at this point, he was a player in his early 30s. So to miss a year at the top level at that age was a real penalty, a massive penalty. But he subsequently got back into the England side and had a triumphant return when he was 39 against the West Indies in 66. Anyway, so that started my Graveney worship, which lasted all through the 60s. But also, just, the Australians, even though they'd been more or less bundled out for 177, they looked classy. They knew what they were doing. Pinter the playwright has a great description of the 48 Australians, 10 foot tall, just kind of coming out of the pavilion and tossing the ball around. And he sees them as kind of giants. And that's how I saw them too. I saw them as giants.
Harry, you touched there on the amateur status and the amateur and professional status in English cricket, which is a real thread throughout the book. And it's fascinating to be reminded of it. And that even at some county grounds in 1961, there were still separate change rooms for the professionals and the amateurs. And you draw a really vivid picture of the stark differences between Benou and the English captain, Peter May, in their upbringings, in their ability to communicate and motivate their players, and even what they did for jobs. Draw us a bit of a picture of that, of those I think you describe them as men from different hemispheres, which is the perfect way of describing these two men. Paint us a picture.
Okay, so Peter May, he was public school, Oxbridge, England. He worked for Lloyd's Bank, so he had a safe job, which allowed him time off in the summer to play as an amateur for Surrey. He first played for England still at university. He was still at Cambridge when he first played against the South Africans and got 100 in his first innings. So he came from a very safe, upper middle class English background, or lower upper middle class. All these kind of class kind of gradations are so subtle, He was spotted as a prodigy at Charterhouse, the public school he went to, by Geary, who was a former England player. So he was kind of always seen as the person with promise all the way through. And the system didn't always reward you if you were in this category, but it It mostly did. So if you had this kind of outstanding ability, then it would look after you, and it certainly did that with him. So he had he was a fantastic player. It couldn't have happened unless he'd been a wonderful player. But being a wonderful player, his circumstances certainly helped him to rise and rise. And when he not first went in, but when he became established in the England side, for the first time, England had a professional captain, Len Hutton. First time it had ever happened. And there was lots of outrage. This was 52. There was lots of outrage at that happening. But then when Hutton retired a couple of years later, May was the obvious successor. So with a big sigh of relief, it went back to, we've got an amateur in charge again. Although what it was said about May was that he was an amateur who played like a professional. So he had learnt from Hutton that you squeeze the game dry. That's how you play. So you don't play cavalier cricket. Of course, if everything's working for you, and he had terrific attack much of the time, bowling attack, then you put on all the pressure. But it didn't train him what really to do when the odds were against you, you were down. He didn't have extra tricks. He didn't have extra kind of ploys to play. Beanud, very different from that. Beanud had a much, as you very well described earlier, much less gilded path to the top. He'd had to really work. They'd kept faith with him in the team, but he had to really work for his place. And then it all happened. All that hard work, all those thousands of balls that he bowled, often on his own in a net, paid off. And he became the cricketer he sort of believed himself to be. And it's always a fascinating story, I think, in any kind of field where somebody becomes the person that they'd hoped and wanted to be and believed they could be. And so, but he had learnt, as you also said, that you have to play to win, and you have sometimes to risk losing to win. And that was a lesson that May never learnt. He didn't understand that lesson at all. And his background didn't train him to, whereas all of Benaud's experiences had really crystallized that. It's all over that fantastic series that he talks about in A Tale of Two Tests, the series against West Indies in 60-61, particularly the first test where Australia could have played for a draw at tea time, but no, they went for the win, and it was the tie, the first tie ever in Test cricket, and one of the other tests that everybody still always talks about. And that was because of Benaud, because he went for the win. And so, he had that mindset. And he also came from a culture so he had it temperamentally and by training, but he also came from a culture that encouraged that, as opposed to a Macmillan England play safe kind of culture that May was part of. Yeah, that's the beginning. That's the beginning of an answer.
No, it's a very good one. I do ponder the extent to which Benaud's experience at Brisbane in 1960 influenced the way that he finished the test at Manchester in 61. What you're referring to there, that knowing that you've really just got to go for it when you can go one way or the other. And Benaud having in some ways matured on television, right? 58, 59 when he's the captain of the Australian team when England are there. That's the first series on TV. I know that that has unintended consequences with Ian Metcalfe and ultimately other bowlers with the chucking scandals. But still, this is a very different feeling world. And England are at the end of an amazing era between 1953 and 1961. I know Australia have won in 58, 59, but England winning under Hutton so comprehensively in 1953, 54, 55 in Australia, winning 3-1. 56, where we've referenced Laker already, but doing the business there emphatically in a dry summer. But yes, given how 1948 almost feels within touching distance at this point. We're only 13 years on from the Invincibles, yet England have had this terrific era, mostly under Hutton, but also Peter May, this generational player coming through who you referred to, who's Hutton's vice-captain for much of that. He's the skipper of the 1956 victory against Australia. That May has been part of an extremely successful team who, at this point, can they do it one more time? Can they keep the era going? It's what makes this series almost the one that ends their period of supremacy.
That's right. I mean, the other thing perhaps to add to that is that England hadn't lost a home series for a long time, since 1950. They hadn't lost a home series since 1950. So they had lost the 58-9, but people thought, although it was on TV, certainly English viewers, as I've read, it happened elsewhere. It didn't happen here, right? So, and then they won again in 59, and then they went to the West Indies in 59-60, and they won there. But also what happened was that May had this ulcer. He had this, this condition that required surgery. So the other factor to bring into him in 61 is that he hadn't played the whole 60 season. He was feeling his way back. There were huge expectations on May, and the hero is going to return, the great batsman is going to return, everything's going to be all right. And he refused to be captain initially, so Cowdrey was captain a bit earlier in the series until May felt he'd got his feet a bit. So when we get to our crucial test, the fourth test at Old Trafford, May is still on his way back, but he's not quite the May of 2 or 3 years before. He's somebody who's still, well, internally at least, needing to prove himself. And the last thing he wants to do is to lose, the test. He desperately wants to win the Ashes, but he's finding it difficult to, unlike Beanud, who had his trials. I mean, Beanud spent much of that 61 season not able to bowl because of his shoulder. And it's such an interesting contrast of two people feeling their way back. Beanud kind of working through it, extraordinary kind of exercises and kind of regime that he had to undertake. He's just got it back again in time for this test, really. And May seems to have done. He gets 95 in the first innings. Everybody kind of thinks the great May is back again. And then on that fateful afternoon of the fifth day at Old Trafford, there's going to be May facing Beanud. Beanud he's just got rid of Dexter by following the plan that he's laid out. And May comes in and he follows the plan and he bowls him. He bowls the ball wide outside the leg stump. May, second ball, he makes this, people call it a sweep. It's not really a sweep because you get into a different body position for a sweep. He does a sort of swat, a kind of stiff arm swat at the ball. Misses, bowled naught. So in a way, the whole book kind of moves towards that moment where the two of them face each other and all the context that is surrounding both them, the match and the moment. And Beanud bowls him. Beanud backs himself. He does the risky thing, not the safe thing. He bowls May. And really, I remember that moment. It was, as an 11-year-old, it was cataclysmic, because my father had told me what a great player May was. And this was the first time I'd seen him, actually play. And I'd seen a little bit of the 95 and that was pretty good. But this was the first time I'd seen him in a crisis situation. And he's bowled for naught, It was a crestfalling moment.
Harry, you should remind us that bowling
Yes.
around the wicket as a leg spinner into foot marks at that time was not the done thing, was it? It was something that Shane
No.
Warne ended up
Yep.
doing a lot. But back then, it wasn't the done thing.
No.
And so, what did you find out about that in your research about, that tactic and where it came from, and what the ramifications of that were?
Right. Okay. Thanks for the prompt. Well, you're right. It was a very unorthodox thing to do, because a right-handed batsman could just cover their wickets with their pads, and you can't be LBW. If it's pitched outside the leg stump, there's no way you can be LBW. You're completely safe. From a bowler's point of view, it's risky, because unless you get it absolutely spot on, it's easy meat. And Beanud had deliberately left the leg side fairly open, so he was inviting May to have a go. So, it's the fisherman lobbing the bait. So he was tossing the ball up, aiming for this very small area, relatively speaking, to pitch the ball in and to spin it out of back towards the wicket behind the batsman's legs. So it's only somebody with kind of very high nerve and expertise can do that. Apparently he'd thought of doing it because he remembered that on that 58-9 tour of Australia, Tony Locke, an English left-arm spinner, had bowled into equivalent footmarks left by Freddie Truman in one state game and had cleaned up. Locke didn't have a good tour at all, and there are other things to say about Locke in a different kind of context. But Beanud remembered. That's the other thing about some of the really great players, really great bowlers particularly, and Beanud was a great bowler, is they have this encyclopedic memory of past games, and they can learn from what they've observed other players, even a left armer. Okay, but he's a spinner, and he's used the rough outside the leg stump or the off stump, depending on. And Beanud remembered that, so he brought his cricketing nous to bear on the situation. And of course, Warne is one of the other players who managed to capitalise on that kind of approach. So,
and this all, speaking of conditions, right? Before this is what part of why it's such a great series is it's not just the Manchester Test match. We've got the Battle of the Ridge a couple of months before at Lords, which goes down as another truly epic Ashes contest where a young Bill Lawry manages to conquer the Ridge. Can you go into some depth about? And of course, Benou doesn't play that test, does he? Harvey captains in Benno's absence because Benaud's shoulder's stuffed, and you've got this different dynamic there. But going to Lords where Gubby Allen was very much still running the show, both at the MCC and in English cricket more widely, and that week with Australia finding a way to get through in most challenging conditions to get their first win in the series.
That's right. Yes. So as David and I read it, because Benou wasn't fit, the Australian selection for the test was pretty much forced into them playing three seamers, three quick bowlers: Alan Davidson, Frank Misson, and Garth McKenzie. England, it's Lords. You should know that you should play three quick bowlers at Lords, but no, they don't. They have an extra quick bowler in the 12, but they don't play him. They've got this, they're obsessed with this idea of the balanced side. And that was also part of that whole kind of thinking at the time. So you have two quick bowlers, you have Ted Dexter who can bowl quickish medium pace, and you play two spinners. The spinners do nothing in that. The English spinners do nothing in that. And Statham and Truman, the two English bowlers, kind of nearly pull something kind of quite miraculous out of the hat in the final innings. They have Australia chasing 60 odd, 19 for 4. which is, so I remember that, and that was also kind of possible. But Australia, partly by faute de mieux, but partly because they were good readers of wickets. They knew that you ought to have 3 quick bowlers at Lord's. What would have happened if Benou had been fit is an interesting point, but I still think they would have had 3 quick bowlers. England, who should have known better, didn't have the right team. It was a very exciting game. Laurie was the absolute batting star of the series. He had really come from nowhere at that point. Wasn't his nickname the Phantom? Wasn't that what they called him after?
Because he used to read Phantom comics.
Yeah, but he was kind of like a it was a good nickname. I love the nicknames. The nicknames are great, aren't they? But I love his nickname because he scored runs without you really noticing. So he was like a kind of phantom in that way. Suddenly you'd realise he'd got 20. Oh, he's got 50. Oh, he's got 100. And you weren't quite sure how he'd done it. He didn't have a very wide range of shots. He had maybe kind of, I don't want to be mean, because they all worked, brilliantly. He had about 5 shots, probably, 5 scoring shots anyway, as opposed to Harvey, who had a dozen, or O'Neill, who probably had more than that, So he was an absolute example of somebody making the very most of their ability. And that's also something exciting about cricket as a game, that there are top players who've managed to make more than the most of what they've got. And some of the more naturally talented ones make far less. So it's that's where the character comes in again, I think, with Laurie, that he was just incredible accumulator. And also, he must have long, he'd had to wait in the wings. So, he wasn't one of those people who'd got shunted in early, like Mackenzie. He'd had to wait, but now this was his moment. And it was his moment for the next decade.
And just quickly before we get back to Manchester, just to bring us up to where we're going to be, the Leeds Test match that follows Lord's, where Cowdrey, who isn't fit himself, plays, makes 93. Truman takes 11 for 88 match figures. England square the series 1-1. So that's the framework going in. But, England on a bit of a roll, and Cowdrey having an influence, having struggled with his own fitness in the early part of the summer.
Okay, yeah, well, Headingley was a road. It was by common consent one of the worst tracks. But it should have been a terrible track for spinners. In fact, it was Truman who took all the wickets. He slowed his pace and he bowled cutters. So he played like a very quick off spinner. But it did mean that suddenly, after the disaster of Lord's, England were back in the hunt. 1-1. Old Trafford, was probably a draw at the Oval. That was what everybody would have expected, the last test. So Old Trafford is the one. That's the one where you're going to either keep the Ashes or regain the Ashes if you're England. So a lot of intensity surrounding the game, packed crowds. I mean, one of the things about watching, there's this amazing footage on YouTube which showed up at a very opportune moment for David and me, and there are some shots of the crowd, and they're spilling onto they're barely kept behind the boundary rope, and then you were asking about details of the time. You see, all the men are wearing ties. They're all wearing ties. It's that kind of world still, where northern men and southern men too. You go to a cricket match and you've got to be properly dressed. You wear a tie. So everything is kind of funneling towards Old Trafford. And Cowdrey, who has caught 2 terrific catches close to the wicket, in addition to that 93, he pulls out. He's too sick on the morning of the game. So nobody quite knows who he would have played. Obviously, nobody quite knows who might not have played. Dexter, who turned out to be rather a star of the match, he perhaps might have gone, or Barrington, who also played very valuably, or indeed Close might not have played. Close probably would have played because he'd done very well in the gentlemen's versus players, another aspect of the amateur professional that you were talking about earlier. Every year there were 2 gentlemen players games. In other words, the amateurs played the professionals, and almost always the professionals won, but occasionally they didn't. But he'd done very well in the recent match, in which, and so had Flavel. That's what got Flavel, another pro, got his part, because he'd completely knocked May out. I mean, May hadn't even seen the ball that knocked his middle stump out. So that was a kind of route into the match for him. So England have can't play Cowdrey, who's the best close catcher they've got. He's not in the Bobby Simpson class, but he's close. He's the nearest that they've got. Simpson in this match takes the most amazing catches people have seen. 2 of them at least, just remarkable. And he gets a crucial 50, and he takes 4 wickets. So he really comes through. He's been a bit of a... they've tried to fit him into the middle order because Laurie has burst into he has to open. Laurie is getting so many runs, he has to open. The normal other opener is McDonald, but McDonald has injured himself. So Simpson can rise from the middle order back to the top, which is where he played against the West Indies the winter before and had been very successful. But he's had to shunt down because of Laurie and down the order because of Laurie and McDonald. But now he can go back to where he's happier. So various kind of inner fate, injury, all those circumstantial things that contribute to final team selection come into play. Cowdrey not playing, England drop crucial catches during the match. Simpson is able to play in a place that he likes. He gets to bowl. The other thing is that Benou enjoys having Simpson bowling at the other end. They're both leg spinners. That's sort of unheard of in England. You never have, one is pretty bizarre, but to have 2 on at the same time, really unusual. So various things kind of shift around if you see it as a kind of chessboard, various pieces shift around on the board, which, kind of have a profound effect on the game.
And Harry, one of the great things about this game is the ebb and flow. England have a lead of 177, but it's Laurie again, isn't it, who gets Australia back into the game?
That's right. It's Laurie and Simpson who get them back into the game. One of the things that we have at the back is 3 puzzles, because 3 odd things happen in the game. And one of them is that England, in fact, after their first innings, have got this very big lead, but it's not out of sight. And it seems that at tea time on the 3rd day, they're told to hit out or get out. In fact, and they're told by one of the amateur kind of backroom boys, either Walter Robbins or possibly Gubby Allen. Not a backroom boy at all, head honcho. And instead of having a massive lead, they have just a very, very big lead. And instead of Simpson and Laurie on the 3rd evening having an awkward half an hour or 40 minutes to last out, they have almost the entire session. So they can play properly like openers. And I think that makes a huge difference to that moment in the game. I mean, you're right. It's constant ebbs and flows and checks and balances and moments of assertion and reassertion. And Laurie and Simpson reassert things crucially. And then that builds up to Australia having, on the whole, a good 4th day until, quite late on. Then a disastrous beginning to day 5. and then the whole game, John Arlott describes it as being like a Greek tragedy. And it is. It's as tense. The whole thing is as tense as a Greek tragedy. And we tried. I don't know how much it worked, but we tried to make the description of the match as gripping as possible, so that a reader would feel there. That was the aim anyway.
Well, I think that works really well with the way you use newspaper clippings and headlines and so on, so that, at the end of each day's play rather, in the book, you feel like you're kind of part of it. You are placed in the shoes of, I suppose, in some respects, the 11-year-old boys that you were.
Yes.
But the other part to this that I just wanted to jump into before we return to this extraordinary final day, final stanza, final part of the Greek tragedy, is the Demons of 1956. Remembering this is the ground where Laker does what Laker does. This is the ground where Australia are effectively humiliated. And having missed out in the first innings, broadly speaking, with the bat here, being so far behind in the game, 177 first innings deficit?
Yeah.
Having to walk out thinking at that stage, really, there are two results. England win and go 2-1 up as we go to the Oval, as it feels like is going to happen from there after how well England have batted in the first innings. Or they find a way to draw it and bat for a very, very long period of time to put England out of the game. But psychologically, doing it at a ground where they'd suffered such a catastrophic performance in their previous trip to England in 1956, Old Trafford.
That would certainly have been on the minds of Harvey, who was out for a pair in that match, as I recall.
Yep.
Also Beanud, and I can't remember. I don't think Davidson played in that game. I think he was injured by then, but I might have misremembered. But crucially, neither Laurie nor Simpson played in that game. They weren't in the test side. So you've got two people who are, as it were, not having to carry the rucksack of the past out with them, to the middle. Laurie is on the crest of a form wave. He's become the character that he hoped to be. And Simpson has just had the fillip of 4 cheap wickets and catches. So actually, you're absolutely right that for the context of the cricketing context of the game, for both sides, the English survivors and the Australian survivors from that earlier game, that's going to be very present. But for the two Aussie openers going out, I don't think that's the case. I think they're able to play as though that hadn't happened, if you see what I mean. And
Sure.
Of course, if one of them had got out early, then no doubt the Devils of 56 would have been kind of resurrected. But of course it wasn't a Laker anymore. Allen was a good off spinner, but he was an apprentice. He'd done well in the West Indies, but he hadn't taken many wickets. But he was a good county, a bit better than that, but he was a very good county bowler. But he wasn't a Laker. He didn't have the experience or the variations, the control. He was good, but, he wasn't a Laker.
Harry,
and
he was good enough to get 3 for none.
At the
beginning of day 5.
He was.
And this becomes a key moment in the Test match, doesn't it? He bowled brilliantly. He tore apart the Australian top order. I think Australia then was only about 160 ahead with 1 wicket in hand.
Yep.
Maybe it was 140 ahead or something.
It's around then. Yeah.
Yeah. And what happens next in the way Alan Davidson plays him and how Peter May responds becomes one of the most crucial moments of this Test match, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yes, you're absolutely right. So Alan, at the beginning of day 5, he's taken 3 for none. He's whipped out Mackay, Benou and Grout. And suddenly Australia, as you say, about 150 on, 1 wicket left. And Mackenzie only in his 3rd test, he's quite a good late order batsman, but he's very inexperienced at this level, and there's a crisis on. He comes out Davidson says, apparently said to him, just play down the line and we'll see what we can do. And for about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, that's pretty much what they do. They just do that. Davidson takes Allen's end and keeps him out. He's not finding him any easier than anybody else has. But Davidson was a terrific bat, and he's got a long reach, and so he leaves balls alone. He reaches far out. He somehow manages to smother Allen, and Mackenzie settles in at the other end. A very tired Statham is bowling at this point. He's knackered. He's basically bowled all the Test match so far, and he's still bowling. And Mackenzie got a good eye. He manages to keep him out, even gets him away for a couple of fours. And then what happens is that May has to basically take Statham off. He just can't bowl anymore. He doesn't bring on Flavel. This is a big mistake, I think, in retrospect. Flavel, who's roughed people up, and there's no reason he wouldn't rough up Mackenzie. He gives Close a bowl. Truman, it said, "Oh, give Closey a bowl. He's good at doing this." He brings Close on, and Close is a sort of lollipops bowler. Some of the lollipops are good, and some of them are awful. And they hit him away for 15 and 2 overs, and things are starting to look different. And then that's the moment that Davidson, who's facing Allen, decides he's going to have a go. And it coincides with May also thinking, we've got to get rid of these two. And Allen has been bowling quite tight and quite flat and turning the ball out of these footmarks. And he says, toss it up. And so Allen, that's what your captain tells you to do. You toss it up. Hit for 6. Toss it up again. Hit for 4. 2 blocks. Hits another 4. Toss it up. Hit for 6. Goes for 20 in the over. And that's the moment where Beanud would have kept him on. Beanud would have thought, right, okay, we've got him out of the defensive mode. He's on the attack. Now's the time that he destroys himself. I'm sure, absolutely sure, 100% sure that Beanud would have kept Allen on. And maybe an earlier Peter May, a more confident earlier Peter May, maybe he might have done. But he whisks him off. And then, as Arlott says, Davidson and Mackenzie batted like openers. They seem like opening bats, and they put on this crucial 98. So again, it's a kind of crucial decision where one can detect a kind of inbuilt defensiveness in May, the sort of drawing back. It's what Hutton, who was always suspicious of spinners, would have done that too. But a bolder captain, a captain prepared to risk more, David, have another one. You'll get him. Would have said that. So you're absolutely right. This is one of the match is so full of key moments, but that's one that crystallizes so much of the kind of forces, cultural and cricketing and temperamental and psychological that are coursing around the match.
So England are chasing, and they're chasing hard. At one stage, they're 150 for 1, and Ted Dexter's batting like a dream. He'd made 100 at Edgbaston in the draw earlier in the series. Yep. And as you say, if Cowdrey was fit, maybe he makes way. Who's to know? But Dexter, who, in so many ways mirrors May's career, or rather he follows May, and he's seen as this profoundly capable cricketer and an amateur, of course, before they changed the designation. Well, that happens shortly after this series, I suppose, but still. Yeah, it does. Seen as having come from that kind of stock and being able to play that kind of innings under that kind of pressure, the whole Test match suddenly revolved around Ted Dexter. That's absolutely right. So England are winning the game. Dexter's on top of the bowling. He wasn't nicknamed Lord Ted for nothing. People used to say, and there's a lot in it, that he sort of played like a kind of Regency buck, but he was also quite aloof. So I think there was a comic called the Beano that had a character called Lord Snooty,
And I think that's why he was also called Lord Ted. Both of those reasons. He's in charge of everything. He's carting. No, he's not carting. He's smashing the Australian bowling all over the place. Benou has put himself on, and clearly Benou is going to bowl pretty much till the end at this point. You know, he's got his strategy, and he's going to just keep going. So at this point, as you say, England need about less than around 100 to win. They're more than up with the clock. They've scored 150 in 123 minutes. And so they're well ahead of the clock, which is part of what had happened with the Mackenzie-Davidson partnership, that it had changed the whole equation of runs and wickets. So Benou starts an over. Apparently Grout says to him, you know, why are you putting these people, where you're putting them? And he says, well, we can only win from this point. We can, we have to risk it. So he bowls him 5 balls, more or less into the rough, which Dexter doesn't, kind of try and score off. He just and then he pushes one up outside the off stump. It's hard to tell whether maybe Benou knew, and maybe Steve, because maybe he told you, whether it's going to be a top spinner, but the angle, he's bowling very wide round the wicket. So the angle is taking the ball across Dexter. It bounces a little bit. Oh God, I can see it on the screen now. It bounces a little bit more. He goes to cut it and he nicks it, and suddenly he's out, and he just, walks off, but tumultuous applause. He seems to have played the innings that has decided the game, but no, he's just played the innings that is the beginning of the decline and fall.
Harry, we mentioned that May goes soon after, but another key moment is then Brian Close comes out to bat, and he starts attacking Benou. He hits him for 6 at one point. And he's trying to, there's some gaps on the leg side, and he's trying to hit with the spin because Close is left-handed. But he gets out, and he gets out caught by Norm O'Neill, who's just been moved to that position after Slasher Mackay, who I think had a strained hamstring and could hardly move. So Benou once again did the right thing, put a fast mover in the field in a key catching position. Norm O'Neill gets Close. I think Close got 7 or 8 or something like that.
8,
8, okay. And so what I find fascinating is the reaction to Close's innings, and you can hear it from, I think it's Swanton on the commentary, is damning of Close's shot. But the same attitude is not applied to Peter May. And I went and looked up Alan Davidson's biography when I was reading your book. And Davidson said, well, we all thought Close was doing the right thing. Number one, because he was hitting with the spin. Secondly, because he was doing what Davidson did to Allen earlier in the day, which was attacking the most dangerous bowler. And it wouldn't have taken Brian Close too many more shots like that 6 he hit to have got the score down and for England to have won that game. Yet everyone said, and Davidson said that he thought May's shot was more reckless than Close's. Yet Close ends up getting the blame. It's blame the Northerner.
It's blame.
The Yorkshireman gets blamed for the loss, not the Oxbridge bloke, when he probably deserved more of the blame than Close did.
I so agree with you. Although I have to confess that at the time, it was agonizing watching Close do this on the TV. I'll just say 2 things. I absolutely agree with your description. Absolutely. He was doing the intelligent thing, but he'd already mishit. And the only thing I think to say against Close is that it was really worth trying. It was the right idea, but he should have seen it wasn't coming off. He'd hit a straight 6 off Benou. He hadn't hit the 6 by the sweep. He'd hit it by getting down the pitch to Benou and hitting him straight. And the sweep, if he could have connected well, and as he rightly says, I think in his autobiography, Close, it was only a matter of a foot or two higher and it had gone for four. That's absolutely true. But why Benaud had moved O'Neill was because Mackay wasn't quick enough to get to the previous miss-hit. So I think the only thing to be said, apart from the fact that, it was cruel and snobbish and completely unnecessary to saddle Close with the blame. The only thing was he did have an idée fixe about what to do, and he wasn't going to change it under any circumstances. And one of the things about Benaud was that he was a more flexible. If something's not quite working, then you try something else. So, that's the only thing I would say that one can hold against Close, that he wasn't prepared to change his tactic when it was endangering his wicket. But
it does all sum up, though, doesn't it? I mean, Steve's point before, doesn't it? Like the whole conversation we're having here about the subtext of how England cricket was set up at the time, the organising structure of English cricket with amateurs, and the fact that, even in the way that Dexter's interpreted and the way you explain that, if you want something done properly, get an amateur to do it, right? That prevailing attitude in English cricket at the time, this different class thing, and the fact that it is the Yorkshireman, and that there was this enduring sort of suspicion of people like that. I think you might even have in your concluding remarks, or possibly it was in Steve's book review, one or the other, that little wonder it took Illingworth to go to Australia in 70-71, another player cut in the same mould as Close, you could say, to actually succeed against this generation of Australians.
That's what we do say. That England, throughout the 60s, even once the amateur status had been relinquished, still made their captains were still people who, in effect, were de facto amateurs, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
they were ones who had played as amateurs before. Dexter, Cowdrey, Mike Smith, all good players, really good players, but of a certain kind of mode and mould. And it wasn't until, Illingworth only gets to be captain of England because Cowdrey's injured. He has this terrible injury at the beginning of the 69 season, and so Illingworth, who's by this point left Yorkshire because there's been a falling out, and has shifted to Leicestershire and has suddenly transformed them into a kind of okay side to something really effective. Suddenly people think, he could be it, and he was. So by the late 60s, a bit of a mind change was starting to go on. Things did shift a bit, not entirely, but they did shift a bit.
But it could have been closer. I guess the other part here is that
it could have been close.
The captain could have been, and Steve makes this point as well when he was writing about your book, is that had they invested in Close, and look, Benaud, reading what Benaud said, you talk about Davo, Steve, Benaud was most gracious about the way Close played. In fact, he said the only player who could have taken the game away that day at Manchester, other than Dexter, was Close. They were frightened of him because of the dynamism from which he played. So, it's interesting that the Australian perspective on Close was one thing, and the bloodletting, the headlines and the newspaper articles that you cite afterwards, it's remarkable. To a person, they savage Close. So having the audacity to try and hit with the spin against Benaud like it's some cardinal sin. It's an extraordinary response.
And they dropped Truman. Who took 11 for 85, as you pointed out, Colo, in the previous Test match. They dropped Truman for creating the footmarks. So they've dropped the two Yorkshiremen. And then Harry and David make the point in the book, Close gets an opportunity to skipper about 5 years later, beats the West Indies when they were playing really well. Close comes up with a tactic about how to get the world's best batsman out. Sobers gets him out cheaply. Close then wins 6 from 7 games, but gets dropped as English captain because he engages in time-wasting tactics during a county game, which you can imagine a Yorkshire captain doing. Yeah, I found that fascinating. That was one of the. There's a lot of things I love about the book, but this idea that Close was this lost captain for England. He could have been the Illingworth that 5 or 8 years earlier, that could have won the Ashes back earlier, that could have helped elevate English cricket at the time. And he was one of those characters who motivated people, had great courage. You could see him in close up, fielding in close, and that's how he got Sobers out, because he was in really close.
Yes.
And you could, just through the stupid old boy network, denied Close an opportunity to skipper England.
Yeah. Yep. Can't argue with that. He was somebody that people followed. Now, he could obviously be an ornery old bastard in certain kind of ways, but people, and both of them much later on as an example, as you said when we were talking, people followed him. He had the people touch. He had, the kind of, which Benou had in spades, but Peter May didn't. May, and it comes out in the book and in some of the comments of other people who played with May, he wasn't at ease with people unlike himself. And, quite a lot of his team didn't come from that kind of background. I mean, obviously Dexter did, obviously Cowdery did when he was playing, Sabaro did, but most of the players, no, they didn't come from that. And he wasn't at ease with them. He wasn't able to have the kind of rapport. One of the wonderful things I think about Benou as a captain, and Close obviously had something, a sort of Yorkshire version of this in a way, was the kind of delight that he took in his own players' performance. And he really visibly showed that. And that's a fantastic quality to have in a captain. One of the things that Graham Mackenzie told me, when he came back from his great partnership with Davidson, Benou went straight to him and complimented him, said, you've kind of rescued it for us. He knew that, Davidson, of course, had played the leading part, but it was Mackenzie who had really kind of stayed. And so, I think it was it Hogg who said that Mike Brearley had a PhD in people? Well, Benou had a PhD in people too. And he knew what made different players tick. He knew that Davidson, you needed to give a kind of kick up, give us one more, Davo, and because Davidson was a famous hypochondriac. Wonderful player, but a hypochondriac. And Benou knew exactly what to do with him to get more out of him. He knew, he understood his players, and that's something that some of those professional captains did. The English, like Illingworth,
with Snow.
With Snow, exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. And
Illingworth used to put boycott at mid-on to get up Snow and tell him to bowl faster, and it worked. Illingworth knew how to press people's buttons, like exactly what you say, Harry. He knew how to motivate different types of people.
It's a great gift at any level of cricket, let alone Test cricket. I played with I played a lot of much humbler level cricket, and I can name the people who were decent captains on half a hand. The ones who made you want to play and play for them.
And Benou, from all that we've talked about across the last hour or so was exactly that. And as we start to wind down our conversation, I think it's worth just having a reflection on the legacy of all of this for Benou and for his opposing number, Peter May. So, 9 for 51 collapse, Benou 6 for, it's his defining performance as a bowler and as a captain. You can tell that by how proud he is talking about it in the 1980s. I happened upon a YouTube clip where Benou's introducing a highlights package of the 61 Manchester Test, and he's it's kind of a quirky clip. He's talking about himself in the third person, and it's very Richie. But the pride is gushing because he knows this is the moment that almost sets him up as such an authority for the next 4 decades. I know he was already an accomplished journalist and all the rest of it, but going to England and winning in 61 and that that mastery of going round the wicket, how unusual it was, the decision that he made, the way that they won the game, and retain the Ashes in such stunning circumstances. I mean, that is part of the platform that helps him become the defining voice on the game in both countries. Well, really until his passing.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And one of I can't help mentioning this. One of the things I love is that learning that when Beanud got back into the pavilion after they'd won, he sat down and laughed. I just think it's lovely. I think that's so, of all the things that one could do, isn't that the most kind of heartening? I think it's just wonderful. I would. The only thing I would say, reverting back to the close thing, is that it is easier to praise somebody on the other side who's failed when you've won. That is easier, If so, it's generous of Davidson and Benaud and other Australians who have said that about close, and they're absolutely right to say that. But it's always a bit easier when you're on the winning side and the other person wasn't.
And as it relates to Peter May, how this affects him as well. I mean, this is the end for him. I said before, it was that great England, not quite decade, but era, let's say, from 53 at home until they lose the Ashes or aren't able to regain the Ashes in 61, the first home loss for 11 years. And he's finished shortly thereafter. He drifts from the game over back to Lloyd's of London, more on the insurance side. But after spending a decade away, ends up back in cricket, ends up within the tent as a selector through the 80s. And that's a period of time where my impression is that they went, well, let's go back to a safe pair of hands, almost maybe part of the legacy of the amateur era that, oh, well, a good old boy, Peter May, let's get him back inside and help sort out English cricket. But it had changed so very much. You look at that 1981 England team, just one generation on, 20 years on. I think I'm right in saying that all bar one of them went to state schools, right? So from what was conditioned in 61 had changed by 81, and that's the next time that Peter May is formally involved in the England game.
That's right. I mean, in some ways he was, the 80s from an English cricket follower's point of view, starts well but goes downhill. I mean, there is the Gatting tour of Australia, of course, which is a little flip up, but it's not a good decade. And one of the interesting things is, though, that he does start to introduce, more diverse players. It's an irony that England have, start to have more diverse players, or than they have really now. Diverse, i.e., those of different kinds of Englishness. So it's in the 80s that black English players start to emerge. That's kind of one of the ironies, I think. But he clearly wasn't much good at that job. He did, his diffidence, his lack of the common touch. Gower is on record somewhere. I remember, sort of saying that he couldn't really connect with anybody. And then they went to Dexter, who had some quite good ideas, but also just kind of completely loopy ones, taken from astrology. I mean, you're right, I think, that there was a kind of reaching back to a sense of an earlier amateurs, and hoping that they would somehow wave a magic wand, and be able to restore something. But, I think it's Gower or somebody says, May's idea against the West Indies, who had four really quick bowlers, still another different four very quick bowlers, was that you should have a balanced side. No, that's not probably the best idea, But of course, it's easy if you're not actually having to play. But even at the time, that didn't seem a good plan or good strategy, given the kind of players that there are around and the kind of players you're playing against. So May's story doesn't really get happier. I mean, he has this golden 50s, pretty well golden 50s, apart from the 58-9. But the rest of it is quite sad, really. Unlike Benaud's, as you say, he becomes the voice of cricket for world cricket, really, for decades. And May dies, quite, in his early 60s, on the verge of being in debt, and honourable debt. David describes that bit very well, I think. That's the social historian side of it. So, in some ways, they meet at a point where Benaud is, he's on the rise and he's kind of at the top, and May is starting to descend. So you get this kind of contrast in fate happening at that. Their fates happening at that moment.
Steve,
gosh, it's good fun talking about this stuff.
No, it is, isn't it, Steve? Any parting thoughts? I mean, again, I come back to where we started our conversation. You've had such an intense amount of interest in this era of cricket. In a way, I'm so pleased that you were the one writing the book review on this a little while ago for the Financial Times. But your parting thoughts at the end of our conversation with Harry.
Well, I really enjoyed the book, and I love all cricket books that impart that social history. A bit like David Woodhouse's fantastic book on the Hutton tour to the West Indies. A bit like Gideon's book, The Summer Game.
Yep.
About Australia in the 50s and 60s. Any of those books that tie in social history and cricket, I just love. One final point about Benaud, I think. We talked about that game that they won in Lords. Lords, that Benaud was not skipper. He showed great leadership even when he was not on the field. He said to Harvey was his main rival to take over the captaincy in the first place. And a lot of people thought it should have gone to Harvey. Harvey was incredibly gracious about Benaud getting the captaincy. And Richie just said to Harvey, do what you like. It's your team, He's just saying, I trust you. You're captain today. Go for it. He also convinced Davidson he had to play. Davidson was badly injured. And without Davidson, they would not have won that test match because they were already without Benaud. So even off the field, Richie was showing that incredible leadership, incredible trust in his players, and motivating them. So he was pulling the strings while appearing to be hands off. So I think he's quite likely the best Australian captain ever. And as you say, Colo, becomes the voice of cricket and a player's man as well. That's why he backed World Series cricket. Because he saw that the players weren't getting enough. Yep. And remember too, one of the last things his last commentary in England was that fantastic 2005 series, and he was not happy that the cricket went to Sky. And he said, "I'm a free-to-air man." He wanted cricket accessible to everybody, and so there are these consistent threads throughout Benaud's career. So I mean, that's the final point I would make, and I really recommend the book. It's a great read, and I love the idea that it's focused on one game, but it spreads out into the series, into the decade, into social history, and I learned things. I didn't think of how important it was the selecting of captains in England and what was going on in the back rooms at that time. And I think it does a great job of shining a light on that world.
I couldn't agree more. The book is called Richie Benaud's Blue Suede Shoes. I'm flashing a version to the camera that won't actually be the one that's on the shelves. It's a lovely picture of Richie on the front. David Carniston and Harry Ricketts. Harry, there you go. Here's the one we want to see. That's a cracker. It's got the two captains there on the front. I look forward to having that on my shelf very soon. I recommend it. I'm sure that people who listen to The Final Word, listen to Book Club, are going to devour this. Harry, thank you for being a terrific guest. Congratulations on the book. And I look forward to citing it for many years into the future and coming back to it. And I'm sure it's going to win a stack of awards as well.
Thank you. It's been a buzz. Thank you.